briefly introduce Mark. And Mark is the private-public partnership. He's a director for Metro. He's the manager of the private-public partnership program. And he's going to tell about it. Last year when we had David Yale, David told us he was going to be hiring and bringing in a manager to run private-public partnerships. And Mark, I believe, is an American Certified Institute of Certified Planner member. And so he knows, I imagine, his urban planning.
Yeah, I have one of my degrees in that, yeah.
Urban planning. So I don't remember all his degrees because I didn't do the cheat sheet, but welcome. Let's give a good welcome to Mark and enjoy it. If anybody wants food, feel free to come up and fetch one. We don't have a pointer tonight, and I don't know what the mic, the speak to mic means.
I don't think I have a mic. Can everybody hear me? I usually project pretty well. But thank you for that. As Mark mentioned, I am the director of the P3 program here at Metro. The agenda tonight is hopefully won't feel as long as I've laid out, but just give an overview of Metro, where we are as the regional programmer and builder, and hopefully you guys know all that, but I'll sort of rehash it. How we look at P3 partnerships in general, based on some of the work that Mike had done for us previously. Looking at our project pipeline, the projects that are queued up as these major sort of design, build, finance, operate, maintain projects, sort of a performance-based P3 look. Some of our PPAs, our power purchase agreements on solar. Some of our work on unsolicited proposals, our policies and procedures on that. The change from the management and organization that David was starting, I think, when he came here last year to talk. Looking at the potential ballot measure that we're proposing for 2016, and then sort of my list of assumptions, which I'm calling a disclaimer here, but just our list of assumptions. As I mentioned, and hopefully you know that Metro is a large organization, the largest county in the country, close to 10 million people, give or take. And Metro itself operates as a planner for the long-range plan, the capital plan, and the corridor plans with environmental clearance on the transportation programs on both the transit and highway side. And with that, we also become the builder and financer, the funder for the rail and bus programs, which again makes it a little bit specialized, a little bit unique relative to some of our peers. Oh, great, thank you.
It doesn't work on that type of screen.
Yeah, that's okay. It's good. I'll point it there. And we also are the regional operator, so we are not only the builder, but we also operate the bus and rail programs in Los Angeles County, along with our mini operators. The P3 program, which is going to be a much easier acronym, is really a continuum of things. I'll show that on my next slide. But a lot of people define it different ways. This is sort of the accepted version from the National Council on P3s. And it's really just any contractual agreement between the public agency and the private sector. Almost anything we do here at Metro has some level of private involvement, be it us contracting with them for simple procurements, for our bus or wherever else. We don't do a lot of the building and construction ourselves. We, of course, hire out to the private sector. But the P3 program really is about the risk transfer and taking some of the things that the public agency or the public sector would normally hold in their portfolio of risks, such as timing, budget constraints, revenue operations, and things like that, and shifting that over to the public sector so that they can then take that risk, or the party that's best able to take that risk and assume that risk. And really, when I'm talking about P3s for this program, we're talking about two different kinds. Sort of our traditional look at P3s, which Metro's had for a while now, which are a lot of the joint development agreements or any type of lease agreements that we have with sort of the properties that we own and the private sector that would want to come in and do some work on that or operate a restaurant or kiosk or whatever they do at Union Station and other properties. And then again, going back to the performance-based P3s, the full concessions or the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, which is what the DBFOM stands for. And really, that's just part of a continuum of what P3s are as well. That you can see the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain is kind of on the further horizon. And this horizontal axis is the degree of private sector risk that gets shifted over. And the vertical axis is really the amount of private sector investment and involvement. And so Metro would, or most public agencies, have traditionally done a design, bid, build, where somebody goes out, designs a project, goes back out to bid, and then another company will come in and build it. Alternative delivery, which again is part of the P3 spectrum, starts with some of the construction management, general contractor ideas, where we just have a little bit of public sector risk shifting back from us to the GMGC, CMGC, and on through the design build. And really, I think for our last couple of years at Metro, we've really transitioned from a design bid build organization to a design build organization. A lot of our major projects have now gone to sort of this alternative delivery of design build. Our last 3 big subways are design build, and going forward, that's likely to be part of it, at least starting with the CMGC, if not fully design build. Kind of moving up the spectrum, if we're going to do design build as one package, one contract, the designer and the builder will come together and do that all as one bid. Sometimes they'll come together and they'll throw the financing into that. Design, build, operate, and maintain. So the financing would be maintained by Metro, but the rest of the project, including the long-term operations and maintenance, would get shifted back to the private sector, and then the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, one big package. Everything kind of goes out to the concessionaire, the developer, and they take care of all of it. Metro really takes no risk at that point, or very limited amount of risk on that relative to what we normally do. And then we have the privatization or concession, which again is the full sale of the asset to the private sector. So it's not something that I foresee us doing. I think we're going to be lucky to get anywhere in this alternative delivery schedule. Yeah, we're going off the chart on that one. So that's kind of how we view alternative delivery in P3s. I think this is a slide that obviously was adapted from the Canadian Council on P3s, and our AVC has put together. And they really just call the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain a P3, and that's a fine definition for me. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Mike, or pretty straightforward, I think. So some of the work that we've done on the P3 program, and a lot of this preceded my involvement here, is that back in 2009, when the board sort of first started looking at P3s, 2008, 2009, we did what we call a project scan, looking at all of our Measure R work, all of the projects in our long-range transportation plan, and seeing if they had any potential for P3 delivery. They identified 14 that had some, and that was later narrowed down to sort of 6 projects that we thought could move forward as P3 delivery, the DBFOM delivery. 3 transit and 3 highway projects. The 3 transit projects, Connector, Crenshaw, and the West Side Purple Line, have all been delivered or are being delivered using design build. So again, on the spectrum of P3, but sort of at the design build stage. So all those contracts were given to a design builder. The other 3, sort of the highway multi-purpose ones, are listed here along with Sepulveda Pass. So we have those projects that I'll talk about here in more detail, but I'll pause if there's any questions on sort of the history and where we're at. Yes, sir.
When David Neal spoke last year, talked about a fund availability aspect. Where does that fit on this, where Metro basically makes a commitment of money over a long period of time, and in the private sector, either essentially is like your financer or something?
Well, I think it's probably the mention of sort of the availability payment, which is how we structure this deal. And so I think that's the issue that we look at for all of these projects. Not only if we hand the equity piece or the financing piece to the private sector, they still want to get paid back for that, for whatever they're putting into the pot. So if they're going to come up with all the financing with the loans and the equity positions, they still want to be paid for that. So we're still going to have to come up and figure out a way to reimburse them. But rather than us paying a separate fee to the designer, to the builder, to the everything else, and all the operations and maintenance, we just pay it as one contract to a special purpose vehicle to a developer. And that would typically be set up either with a revenue stream from tolls or availability payments, which is probably what he was talking about. So it's just how we would then sort of structure the deal to let them front all the money and figure out the timing to best deliver the project, and we would agree to pay them back at some fixed denomination over the course of 20, 30, 40 years.
And how does the financing charges differ between fund availability and one where the private operator simply has the stream of income coming from tolls or something else?
It would vary depending on what the project is. So for most P3 projects that we would see that we're looking at within these, it wouldn't differ a whole lot. There would be an equity piece which they would typically target some sort of internal rate of return around 10 or 12%. But a lot of the publicly backed ones that Metro would support would be through TIFIA loans or through private activity bonds, PABs, would typically be at sort of, tax exempt rates. A TIFIA rate now is around less than 2.5%. PABs are for a AA project would probably be around 3%. And so we'd still get tax exempt financing on those pieces. The equity piece would have a higher rate of return on it.
But Metro would pay the interest, and it's not money that the private sector is borrowing and they pay the interest on. It's interest that Metro pays.
There would be packaged as part of the P3, so the private sector would pay that interest and we would reimburse them for that. So, I mean, all P3s, all deals are paid back in either tolls or taxes. Yeah, I mean, there's no other way to do it. I mean, fair revenue, tolls, whatever you want to call it. But all deals are going to get paid back through those means. There's no free money out there. The developer is the conduit for, let's say, a TIFIA loan, which we would normally take on ourselves. We would just transfer some of that obligation to them to set up the TIFIA loan to make sure it meets their equity needs and their timing for the project. And let it go from there. So, they would in essence take out the TIFIA loan. We would be guaranteeing the repayment of that loan as the project sponsor. Or Caltrans, the highway project, it would still be our backstop. Anything else? Yes?
Theoretically, Todd, though, so far there is an example of one in the U.S.
Of what?
Transit-oriented development.
Oh, I think there's lots of TODs being paid for as a P3.
Yeah, as part of the P3 itself, there's proposals, but not one really underway.
I mean, I know there's lots of them that have still some tax increment financing or value capture pieces to it. I guess depending on the definitions of how you would classify a TOD or financing or P3, you could argue the point either way.
Transportation project is the method paid.
So the TOD paying for the transportation project? Yeah, I don't know what that means. I know there's one that they'll contribute to the revenue stream, but in terms of a standalone project like that, being able to pay for it, I don't know of any. I mean,
not in this country.
Not in this country. Yeah, I mean, you can get some of the big value capture pieces out of the high-speed rail lines in Japan, but even that's paying 30% of the cost, not the full cost.
Maybe with the
For the
EIFT
East
or
Coast,
something like that.
that's what they're looking at,
There's possibilities.
which may happen.
What's that?
High-speed rail for the East Coast.
It'll contribute to it. I don't think it'll be the end of it. And again, the enhanced infrastructure finance districts is another piece of that sort of, probably a whole separate spectrum of things to look at as financing alternatives. The P3 program, I'll just start going through these sort of 4 mega projects that we've identified, and we can kind of have additional dialogue or questions for these. But the first one that I wanted to talk about is really the Sepulveda Pass. And as Bart mentioned, it's something that sort of has had some grassroots and different pieces of it. It's still a massive, still somewhat of an undefined project, going potentially from the 405-5 connection in the north all the way down to Los Angeles Airport. Depending on the cost and what we're looking at, it includes primarily some sort of an option over the Sepulveda Pass, so say from the 101 to the 10 is what we're looking at currently as a viable option, or at least the first phase of a complete corridor. And again, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood, depending if we're just doing an enhanced HOV lane over Sepulveda Pass of, you know, around $2 billion, up to a full corridor with a transit option as well as HOV, HOT lanes, just over $30 billion in sort of year of expenditure dollars over the 3 decades. So it's a massive project. If we're just looking at sort of the Sepulveda Pass, sort of 9 or 10 mile section between the 10 and the 101, potentially with over-the-top HOV, HOT lane, along with bus rapid transit, and then a tunnel, so sort of a heavy rail tunnel going underneath Sepulveda Pass. We're looking at somewhere between the $7 to $10 billion range. We've identified sort of $8 billion, give or take, depending on when we be able to get the project started and how long construction would take.
When you say over the top, you mean like the elevated express lane?
No, just what's on there now.
On the 110?
No, what's on there now. So the Sepulveda Pass, just that's the top of the mountain. Nothing elevated, just the top of the mountain. The surface option, I guess, would be better off calling it. So it's at-grade managed lanes with BRT, as that first bullet says. We're also looking at an option that would include a tolled highway tunnel along with BRT. So again, a big diameter bore underneath Sepulveda Pass with BRT. And then another one that might just be a rail tunnel with, again, sort of the vehicles over the top of it. And then a toll highway tunnel with rail. So again, that's the full sort of managed lane or express lane in a tunnel along with some rails. So it might be a twin bore, it might be one large bore, one medium-sized bore. But those are the options that give us this massive range of $2 to $30 billion. So it's not that we haven't sort of identified what the cost is going to be, it's just that the alternatives are dramatically different given the length of the corridor, whether there's going to be just a vehicle alternative or a BRT alternative, or if there will be that along with some rail alternatives. And the different alternatives give you a pretty big range. We do think the project can be done in phases, so we don't have to, you know, swallow the whole horse in one bite. That we think that we could probably do some sort of a surface at grade alignment. Again, improving what's already on Sepulveda Pass in terms of the widening the HOV and converting that either to a wider lane, putting in 2 hot lanes, or, you know, maybe just looking at expanding the HOV lane to HOT lanes. So we think that can be fairly simple. Whether we want to add BRT on top of that with some flyovers and some connectors, that would add the cost a little bit, and that's where we get sort of the $2 billion number is putting in some flyovers, some HOV connectors at each end of the Sepulveda Pass. The full segment, of course, would be all the way from LAX to the 5. Much bigger, much harder project to do in terms of timing and cost, but it's still one of the alternatives we're looking at. To date, we've had a number of studies. They've kind of given us inconclusive numbers in the sense that we don't really have a solid project description, so it's hard to say we have good understanding of the revenues or the potentials. We know what we've committed in terms of Measure R in our long-range transportation plan, but we don't have a full idea of what the cost will be, what the revenue opportunities are. We have some idea of what the possibilities are, but in terms of sort of making that a financial commitment that a developer would be willing to take on as part of their portfolio, we're not quite so sure on. So right now we're doing a financial strategy study, which again is helping us identify what the revenue potential and the costs are for that. Again, sort of looking at a meta-analysis of the data that's already been conducted, bringing that into either, you know, from year of expenditure dollars into 2015 dollars, or some of the studies were done in 2011, 2012, and just updating the costs and revenue projections from those. So that should be done, you know, sometime this summer. I think we've identified July, but, you know, those things sometimes slip. So that's kind of where we are with Sepulveda Pass and what we have in mind. And so it's really a staging of what this program is going to do from a study level, because we think after we get done with this financial strategy, it'll basically gear us into looking at more revenue options for the corridor, whether that be a potential additional ballot measure, additional toll revenues, or enhanced rail project. Any questions? Yes.
If the intent is to actually have contiguous service from LAX to the valley, does it really matter whether you build the tunnel through like UCLA in the mountains, or do you have to go under the 405?
I think the alignment isn't necessarily the barrier to that. It's really, again, going to be where the connections are, what it's going to connect to, and how it's going to connect. And really the modes of transit that will connect to it. Right now, say in the UCLA area, our plan is to have the purple line as a heavy rail connecting to that. So it makes sense to have a heavy rail going north, but there's no heavy rail connections in the valley. And even if we convert the orange line, that would likely be a light rail. So the full sort of one seat connectivity is difficult to achieve. We do have the option of looking at the airport and trying to figure out if we want Crenshaw or the green line to swing north and make some of those connections either on the Crenshaw line east of UCLA and then continue that into the valley.
But
So
the TBM doesn't care whether it's under the freeway or under the mountain? It's
No,
the same.
I haven't done the soils, but I don't think it cares. Unless it's got a big cement pipe in it, then it hates it. Is there a question back here?
Water.
Yeah, that's the other option. Maybe we want to, if we're doing tunnels anyway, we'll throw in a viaduct. The High Desert Multipurpose Corridor is sort of the next project we wanted to talk about. And it again is a multi-purpose project that originally started looking at it as a highway connection between, again, basically the SR-14 in LA County and SR-18 in San Bernardino County. And then we had additional proposals come to us from, I guess, a private developer looking to extend rail from Las Vegas to their current plan in Victorville, but then making it all the more sort of attractive for their users to go to Palmdale and into Los Angeles County. So they thought, well, we have the right-of-way now, and we have some capabilities of helping them design and clear an EIR and do right-of-way eminent domain work for them. That maybe it would make sense to have sort of a joint project looking at this, and that there might be synergies that both modes could bring on. At the same time, we also thought, well, other modalities such as a bike lane or other facilities that might help this, and that's where we get into sort of the multi-purpose idea, is that there's some sustainability, green energy, solar panels, methane farms, things like that might be able to contribute to the work done on this area. And the tricky part of this project is its size. It's essentially, say, 50 miles from Palmdale to Victorville, or 60 miles. And the project is looking at about 50 miles of that is a P3, and really the center 30 miles is a potential toll road connecting those either as a freight corridor or a goods movement corridor. So right now it's just desert out there, but we're hoping for more. Yes. Whoever wants to go. You go.
At the JTA meetings, high-speed rail brought up the fact that they changed the alignment, so the EIR has to be redone now. Is that correct?
I think they're looking at an amendment to the EIR to accommodate the new alignment. So it's not obviously not a fully redone EIR. The EIR is still in draft, so that's part of the amendment that they anticipated as part of this. We've been working with high-speed rail on that alignment. It's really just moving it south a little bit and changing the shape of the Y going north.
It's 8 to 9 more months now?
I don't know what the timeline is. I know it's lengthened it, but I don't know what the timeline is for that.
So that from Palmdale, the blue line, is that right alongside the 14?
Yeah, so that goes to the 14, then sort of back in.
No, north, going north.
Oh, going north? I think that is the 14, yeah.
So is that the 99?
That's all the high-speed rail alignment. That's the latest high-speed rail alignment. So that's their alignment. The corridor segment that I'm talking about is really in here.
Okay.
And so this would be the high-speed rail alignment. There would be the joint station connecting not only the Express West area going to Vegas, but also the California high-speed rail going south, and then potential for a goods movement or toll road.
But that's the high-speed rail option going next to the freeway, not under the mountain.
I could answer that.
Go for it.
Go for it. Last Monday, I was at this nuclear blast type of meeting the city of Santa Clarita put on for an emergency meeting. emergency meeting, brought out 1,000 people, and it was all the people that, of course, don't like high-speed rail. But there's two route possibilities. Supervisor Antonovich has figured out a route that goes essentially from Palmdale to Burbank and cuts out about 12 or 13 miles by going around the old Southern Pacific, Metrolink, Union Pacific route by going in a tunnel. There is so much mitigation already promised to Santa Clarita, Acton, Saugus, and the communities, and Acton, communities up there, that it's almost a wash, we believe, to go from Palmdale directly to Burbank, and it'll save anywhere from 3 to 12 minutes on the route. But that, community meetings are there. The city of Santa Clarita doesn't want it coming through Santa Clarita, but amazingly enough, the horse community, equestrian community, from Sunland to Hanga and Sun Valley and the neighborhood here has come out and said they don't want the train going through there. And what the public really doesn't understand is, since it is the state of California, a bond passed by the state, it's enacted, the project is coming through for real. How it comes about and what kind of angles, but it seems from the Sierra Club point of view and Transit Coalition point of view, we'd like to see the most direct route because it saves time. Originally, the only point of having it come through this way was that there potentially might have been a station in Santa Clarita, and when the decision was made to make stations every 40 to 50 miles, no station, so why do you go the archaic route from the 1880s or 1890s with the survey route? Just go directly. So it's been in turmoil. The city of Santa Clarita's been frothing things up, and they're attempting to ensure that they're the big person on the block, and because somebody, but the idea is that it can go in a tunnel. I've talked to the different engineers with the different companies. Everybody doesn't see anything amazing about going in a tunnel. I think Tim built the tunnel, and is that true? You were involved in the tunnel? So how many miles is the tunnel?
I'm sure
20 miles, so the mileage isn't a big deal. We've done tunnels in Switzerland, we've done tunnels everywhere. So it's just kind of a question of if the public will is there, the project moves forward, a route we chosen, but the neighborhood constituencies have never heard of a tunnel. And everybody here, if you live on a street, you've got sewer pipes, water pipes, any kind of pipe, electrical conduits. So tunnels are no big deal. Every city council member knows what a water pipe is. So it's just a matter of how the authority works, and do they want to put a big trench along San Fernando Road and sound walls, or do they want to go quicker and safer and stay out of the public encumbrance? So back to you.
The tunnel is 31.5 miles.
So we know tunneling can be done. It's not the end of the world to go.
You said that was 20? Technology is not the issue.
It's, the issue is
Politics.
politics.
Yeah, so we see that in all these projects, politics, and this is again a politically sensitive project as well. But essentially, again, it comes back to looking at what the funding level is for this project, how much we'll need in terms of availability payments to support whatever alternative we would choose. It's still, the draft EIR has been released, so we still don't even have a locally preferred alternative for the EIR to really study. But essentially, when we're looking at a financial analysis, it's different alternatives covering that middle segment and figuring out how much we can generate from toll revenues, how much we might be able to talk to our other partners with on the rail side, or the solar sustainability pieces, and if those can generate enough revenue to close the capital funding gap, which right now is somewhere between $4 billion and $8.9 billion. And again, it's not necessarily the engineering that's giving us that much of a delta. A $4 billion project is essentially a highway between those two areas with all the connectivities that's required and all the right-of-way, eminent domain acquisitions that we have to make, along with the sort of embankments and the build-up of the project. And the $8.9 billion is then adding a high-speed rail cost to that project. So it's somewhere about 50/50 on the highway cost and the rail cost.
With the high-speed rail, sharing the cost with that one station?
No, that station's sort of outside of this analysis, so it'd just be the additional cost for right-of-way acquisition, some of the berming that would be required, the grade separations for the rail project, electrifying it, and the connections at the 2 points.
I thought there was a component involving electric, high voltage transmission and revenue from high voltage transmission lines.
So part of the multi-purpose is that transmission component and how much revenue we'd be able to get from contributing to the transmission for either the sustainability projects tied into this project or from SCE or any other providers that might be interested
You're
in.
talking about some kind of solar farm in there as well?
Yeah, it could be, yes. I think the alignment has capacity to have solar along at least the 50 miles throughout different pieces of it. Some of it's already being developed, and some we could add to.
And a good analysis would be Germany for solar, because they are the largest producers of solar energy.
And they've got 1/10 of the amount of sunshine they
And
do up there.
it's all over their highways, so.
Yeah, so we've seen that, and we've done a number of different analysis of this, including some of the, what do they call it, the piezoelectric, the sort of vibration dampening components for sustainability, looking at some of the freeway alternatives for that. So there's a bunch of different ways to look at this. A lot of the sustainability things, even though they're revenue positive, aren't going to close a $4 billion capital gap. And I always feel like I have to emphasize the B when I talk about this project, because those are billions of dollars. So that's what we're looking like. Again, we're doing the strategic financial plan on this to sort of better quantify the total revenue projections that are in the EIR, and to get a better understanding of any contributions we might be able to receive from either the Express West project, California High-Speed Rail, as well as the sustainability's transmission, whatever other pieces of the multi-purpose project could contribute to it. We happen to have that study done by the end of the month. We'll have a better understanding of what the capital funding gap would be and how much contribution we need from other local, state, and federal sources to make this project move forward. Any other questions on this piece? The next one is I-710 South. And this one is in constant flux. And it's again sort of the piece that has a lot of different objectives, a lot of different goals, a lot of different things have changed since the original concept came up, where we would have some sort of an elevated road going from the port of LA Long Beach up to 710 to SR 60 as a freight sort of goods movement road where we could charge trucks to use that. And there's a lot of, again, sort of congestion management, air quality goals that were tied into this. The EIR sort of went out and identified some additional concerns, but some of the things that they looked at as part of this $5.3 to $9 billion project, again, depending on what sort of alternatives we choose. The no build, which I think would probably lower that from 5.3 billion down to 0. But also some of the TSM, which again is just sort of the schedule synchronization of the lights and some of the different electronic signing that we can do, some widening, some geometric improvements, signal timing, sort of the enhancements that you might find on arterials outside of a freeway. As well as the 4-lane freight corridor, which gets the price of closer to $9 billion. If we do decide to do all these other sort of improvements, or what we call early action plan improvements, along with an elevated freight corridor, which we don't think is financially viable. There's been a lot of shifts in terms of what the port freight operators are doing, what the rail companies are doing, what the OTR companies are doing, the trucking companies are doing. So we don't really think the 18-mile elevated freeway is going to work in this corridor. So what we've done is gone back and looked at what improvements we can make and what other revenue streams we can get. As part of the initial studies, or some of the initial studies, when this project was starting, included a container fee, which was a big sort of national container fee that the shipping companies pushed back on quite a bit. And again, we sort of, well, the nation, when I say we on this one, decided it's not a good path for revenue generation. However, we've come back to the idea that the ports of LA and Long Beach, which are not only the generators of a lot of this traffic, but would be the recipients of a lot of mitigation or improvements that we have on the corridor, might be amenable to some sort of a container fee that stayed in this corridor that was going to be used just to build this. And of course, as with any sort of massive public works project, like the ports that we have here, that are moving 15 billion 20-foot equivalent units of cargo through their ports every year, 40% of the goods in the United States, we think it's right for some sort of financial contribution. So when we look at that, we think, well, if we did charge, say, a $10 container fee to help the ports improve this sort of exit out of their area, would they be willing to do it? We're entertaining whether we can take that to them and not have longshoremen knocking on our doors. But again, we look at mostly going the fee back to the shippers and not to necessarily the dock workers or the truckers. And so again, it'd be on the shippers, which they have the ability to move out of the San Pedro Bay ports and to other ports on the West Coast, or as the Panama Canal expands onto Texas and East Coast ports. We don't think that would happen, certainly not for a $10 container fee, which is very nominal relative to the size of all their fees, their shipping costs, and the value of the cargo. But it's one of the things that we look at. If we were able to do that and do some sort of a match, we think we could generate between $2.5 and $5 billion on container fees over the course of a 30-year project to help fund some of this project. Again, it wouldn't be the full 18-mile elevated corridor, but we would be able to make some improvements that we think would be measurable and impactful on the SR, or on I-710 South. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. Again, we don't have the financial strategy fully scoped out for this yet, where we could start a discussion with the ports as to whether they'd be agreeable to going to the shipping companies asking for this. We're hoping to have something sort of moving forward by the end of this year, by the end of this financial year, so in the next couple months, to work on that financial strategy. And again, just sort of a sizing exercise to figure out how big of a funding gap we really have, given what the local cities and the local constituents would want for a project, what that would cost, and how much we think we could find in funding. There are a lot of constraints, a lot of issues, a lot of different parts and different needs on this corridor, but we're trying to find some solutions, and we think some of our early action contributions, as well as the container fees, might be a possible solution. Any questions on
I thought it was already decided that they really couldn't widen the freeway all the way through.
Yeah, so they can't widen it, which is why they were looking to elevate it. But they do think there's some opportunity to make some improvements, either on the throughput or routing, or some of the early action plans in terms of signal coordination and other improvements that you might make.
There's no way to have rail take up most of the slack.
That's another piece of the discussion, but again, for goods movement, you know, a lot of the shipping companies have their own rail contracts in. So I think when we're looking at it, we're starting to see that whatever Metro does or a public agency does is a little bit slower than what those private shipping companies can do to change their sort of modalities, their over-the-road or freight logistics, their drayage movements. So again, if we thought we can do that, but we'd have to have some sort of revenue mechanism that they might not want to participate in because it's not what they typically
I see these huge rail yards that have a decent amount of space, and it would seem to me you'd want to get stuff out of the port as quickly as possible instead of having 8 million trucks all on top of each other.
So a lot of that's a coordination issue, right? Since everybody that owns a container is somebody different. And so they might not want their container in the same batch or the same speed or the same pace or in the same truck, freight, whatever they're doing to get it there. So it's really upon them to schedule how they want it out of the port. We can certainly provide them the avenues to do that, figuratively and literally. But it's really up to them as to how they end up moving it. The shipping companies direct a lot of that. The trucking companies also have a part in that. So there's a well-established, well-entrenched way to do that. And again, anytime we would start to propose something and they were thinking it was costing them money, they would sort of update their plans and change and move and go from a largely over-the-road freight-based or trucking-based modality into a rail piece. Or they start to say, well, we'll take this sort of break bulk up to Richmond or down to Tijuana or something, and we can't influence them. We can provide a better way to get them out of the port, but we can't make them take a different way of doing it. So we're trying, but it's a challenge. So that's why we think too, if we go back on the shippers, where it's still on the boat and that's where the fee is, then once it gets into the harbor, they don't really care which way it goes out. As long as there's improvements on the 710, we think we could encourage them to go up the 710 in the direction we want. But I think forcing them into a different modality has just been a big challenge.
You said there's something about the bond measure, this California bond measure, there's some more authority. Would that be something that could be a funding source and also give you some more leverage?
I guess I don't know which bonding authority would be.
I don't know, you said something earlier about a bond.
Well, we have an initial ballot measure potentially that we would look at, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that can certainly contribute to it, depending on what gets passed, if it gets passed, and even if it makes it onto the ballot. But yeah, so we think there are an additional revenue stream for this if we are able to get some container fees in. But again, it's a lot of big ifs, including getting shipping companies to agree to pay several billions of dollars in fees they don't currently. The last project as part of this sort of performance-based P3 initiative that we're looking at is the SR 710 North. I think it was traditionally called the gap closure. I think it's just called 710 North now. The funding available that we've identified in our long-range transportation plan is about $1.6 billion. The project cost estimates, again, range, I think we've said that it's $3.25 billion in 2011 dollars. The updates are probably going to close to double that. The draft EIR was circulated, it started being circulated in March 2015, so we're still in the public comment period. Actually, I think they're having meetings on it tonight, so apparently you wanted to be here more than those. And again, the goal of this is to sort of close the link between the 10 and the 710 on the 710, the 10 and the 210. So again, looking at the various alternatives as to where to close that link is really the rub here. And again, it goes sort of a fan through that whole little highlighted area there as to what the best alternative would be. So it's still undecided. There's still a no-build option on the table, obviously, as part of the EIR. And so until we get a locally preferred alternative, probably in at least 6 to 12 months from now, we don't really have any idea of what this project will entail. We do think it's got a lot of interest in doing something, pro and con. But again, we have a significant funding gap between even the low estimate of $3.25 billion and $1.66 billion. It's still, $1,600 million apart at the minimum.
And the purpose is to connect to the 210 going east to the Ontario container yards?
That's one of the alternatives, yeah, so to move it into inland ports. And largely, if you look at sort of a diagram of where the ports, the San Pedro Bay ports go, it's, by and large east, whether that's on the 60, the 10, or the 210. It's really, again, depending on where those inland ports are and where their transfer areas are. So again, it's to just close this gap that's been there since the 70s, so 40 plus years, 50 plus years. So to think that it's going to happen again this year might be overly optimistic based on history, but that's sort of the goal that we have for this. Again, looking at funding this, we need some potential new revenue source. And again, as with all of these, it's either going to be tolls or taxes. Is there another question?
Is the tunnel alternative, as proposed in the draft EIR, the only alternative for which you're considering P3?
No, I think we'd consider it for any alternative, depending on the scale. What the project would look like as a P3 and its commercial viability or acceptability by private interest would change a lot depending on what those alternatives are. The tunnel, I think, sort of has risen to the top of that from the developer perspective, because they do think that the toll mechanism on that would generate enough revenue to help cover some of those costs. But it'd likely be that Metro would still have to cover whatever gap there would be between the tolls, the operating tolls, the net tolls, and the cost of the project. So it would still be likely billions of dollars in funding gap.
But for instance, bus rapid transit and light rail alternatives, which are well over $1 billion, would also require presumably some sort of private.
Yeah, I mean, to close the funding gap, or again, the decision on our board on the taxpayers in Los Angeles County to move this onto their priority list and to get this funded with other Measure R or other ballot initiatives to fund it. So it's always a zero-sum game, right? I mean, we don't have enough to do everything. I think our wants are like 240 million, our resources are like 50 million or billions. Yeah, just
What's the division of responsibility on financing between Metro and Caltrans on this project and on the 710 South? How is the Metro versus Caltrans, who's putting what money or potentially putting the money in?
I can't speak for Caltrans. I mean, on the projects that I've seen and the work I've done, they don't have any money. I mean, they have some funds to do some of the long-term maintenance, which is their charge. But on any new projects that we would put forward, we would be either entirely responsible for the financial picture or, a good 90% of it. Caltrans just doesn't have the resources for new projects like this in terms of their financial profile and picture. So we wouldn't expect a whole lot from them other than what they would use as their shop fund, which is typically the maintenance piece that they do.
What would be the inter-project impact of, let's say, funding the 710 North versus funding Sepulveda Pass? Are you analyzing what's the overall budget impact between these four P3 projects? And if one goes first, does that mean that another one can't go second or can't go third? Is there a total universe of P3 money that you're looking at for Metro?
There's not a pre-prescribed number. I mean, obviously we're looking at that within all contexts, right? So if we're looking at something like, say, Sepulveda Pass, which is a third decade Measure R project, skipping ahead, it's going to have a revenue stream that's not Measure R. So that would be some sort of a toll revenue in what they'd call in the P3 world a revenue risk model, where the P3 developer would say, Metro will say, we'll give you all the revenue you can generate from tolls, but you have to build it and fund this whole project. We're not going to contribute anything to it. And so in which case, we're not taking anything from any of the other projects, and that would help accelerate Sepulveda Pass as the example. Whether it's some piece of that where some of it's supplied by the toll revenues and some of it's supplied by either Measure R, New Ballot Initiative, or other sources. And again, it's going to have a give and take with these other projects. So there is sort of not necessarily a prioritization on these projects, but in Measure R we did identify which ones were first decade projects, second decade projects, and third decade projects. And Sepulveda Pass is the example of the third decade project, and some of these other ones are first and second decade projects. That would be available for funding would be available for them first.
Well, when the deal was here last year, he said that there was some point in the next few years when the first Measure R money would be, become more flexible in terms of where it can be spent, starting in 2018 or 2019. So that whatever was committed or previously committed to one project might get freed up in terms of those decade priorities. What do you know about that?
Not as
Flexibility.
not as much as David, I'll tell you that much. So I think probably what he's speaking to is some of the equity, sort of what we call the geographic or jurisdictional equity pieces of it. So the city of Los Angeles or the West Side, San Fernando Valley, or the gateway cities spend their money, and then we've sort of moved through that Measure R. It then frees up additional Measure R monies for projects in other sub-regions to move their projects forward. So it's not necessarily more money, but it's just the other entities either reprioritizing their timelines and needs, and then making that money available for these different sub-regions, or not. But realistically, the Measure R is fairly limited, both in terms of what it can do by the type of fund, whether it's going to do rail, capital, or bus, or operations, etc., and how much is available for each sort of sub-region. And we do have sub-regional needs that we need to make. We can have some flexibility as to the timing on those, but we have to make all of our sub-regions whole so that, and again, I don't know the exact numbers, but say there's 8 sub-regions and $40 billion in Measure R. Each of those have to get about $5 billion in projects delivered to their sub-region. And if that's not happening by 2039, we have to make those sub-regions whole through a cash contribution.
That reminds me.
There's a provision in Measure R that does allow, I believe it's 20 years after the original vote, which would be 2018, where the MTA board can change the priorities. But it is very unlikely that would be politically feasible.
Yeah, the board can change those priorities, but if we're again just sort of the natural order of Measure R, I mean, things can always get done.
Something you said reminded me, earlier this year, the MTA board amended the boundaries of the subregions.
Yes.
And created a new subregion of the regional, Union Station, LAX, there might have been one more, I forgot. But they created a new regional facilities subregion and changed the boundary between the west side subregion and the downtown subregion. So that indicates that there's some, what you call it, geometric flexibility as opposed to financial flexibility.
Yeah, so I mean, the board has the power to make changes to Measure R within certain limits. I mean, obviously the voters through a 2/3 vote made the dictates on that, but also gave the board some flexibility in changing parameters. That's one of them. And again, it's sort of not necessarily created new ones, but broke up some of the equity pieces that the city of LA was fully in their region and gave it off to the Union Station, the maintenance yard down 96th Street in the Gateway Cities area. And again, looking at San Fernando Valley, which was typically part of the city of LA, into its own sub-region. So it's just, again, sort of taking away some of the equity that was originally identified for the city of Los Angeles.
And isn't there a bill now pending in legislature that gives you even more flexibility, 676 by Evans, I think it is? Isn't there a MTA-sponsored bill to give the MTA board even more flexibility on these reassignment of priorities?
It's not P3 sponsored.
No, it's not that.
I don't know.
It's not a big bill.
No, yeah, so I don't know. I don't know what it is. Yeah, I mean, there are voting thresholds that are changing. And again, the likelihood of that passing would be great, but I don't know what that is. So yeah, I don't follow that as closely as our legislative affairs group does. I'm aware that they're out there, but I don't have any details on it.
Another question?
If there was a P3 proposal on the gap for dedicated freight lines, is it legal to prohibit the freight companies from using other corridors other than that one sort of toll corridor?
Not to my knowledge. I haven't heard of anything like that. I don't know if there's any prohibitions. Typically, you wouldn't be able to interfere with that, particularly with the freight, who are under a federal jurisdiction and can't be controlled by either
One of the
states or
discussions I've
otherwise.
heard, you could build this and then the truckers would still opt to go the old way, and the congestion would be sort of shifted for other people, but not for them, and then it wouldn't really solve the problem.
Probably have to do it by pricing, not by dictate.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, there's always ways to sort of give them incentives to do things, but again, they have to follow those
The reality is
incentives.
there's not much demand for trucking to go north in that corridor. Yeah. Most of the trucking wants to go east before it hits 10, or use 10 or 6.
And
So
any
there's
light,
not much demand for trucks in that corridor.
and any light rail link does nothing for freight.
Right. The light rail wouldn't support freight.
A few weeks, follow up on this question, a few weeks ago, there was a debate between the pro-710 tunnel people and the anti-710 tunnel at Cal State LA. And everybody, both the two city council members favoring it and the two council members opposing the tunnel, all four of them said that there should be no trucks allowed in the tunnel as a matter of safety. So is that, so that you're assuming there will be trucks in the tunnel?
No, I don't make any assumptions on that. I don't think. I mean, again, we haven't made the assumption that there's going to be a tunnel. Certainly not assuming what's going to happen there. I don't think it's going to be a truck-only tunnel, but it could be. And again, it's going to be whatever the LPA dictates. We'll follow that course. In terms of sort of commercial viability as a P3 for a truck tunnel, that's a more challenging prospect because again, it would make them follow the disincentive of paying a toll into a tunnel, and we don't think that's a likely course that many developers would take on because we don't have a way to control them.
You ban trucks from the 5 or from the 605 or something.
Yeah, so we'd be happy to. We have to get agreement from Caltrans and FHWA and everybody else to do that, along with
Congress.
yeah, a literal act of Congress once again.
Do you ever have to deal with the notion of a project of national significance, that designation, which allows a federal sort of clearance through the different jurisdictions that often can have different requirements and different
So we do. The High Desert Corridor was another one of those that we were looking at getting sort of this federal designation of national significance. All of these projects, we can certainly bring that argument forward. Anything that's going to come out of or have an impact on the ports and the goods movement in Los Angeles is going to qualify as that likely. Again, you know, my role on that is non-existent, so I'm not exactly sure how that falls. SCAG takes a lot of the goods movement planning and work from Metro on that piece of it, but you know, obviously it impacts us. So you know, we work within those parameters, and if there was any benefit to it to fund this or to build this, we would obviously kick that stone over. Another one. So I think that's the last of the big projects. The next piece I wanted to talk about was our unsolicited proposal procedures, which again came out about, well, I guess the idea, the genesis of them came out about a year ago to really get to move this forward. Obviously, I think anybody that has a P3 program is going to want this route to bring proposals forward. Metro's traditional policy on unsolicited proposals has been that I think technically they do not encourage them. So we tried to get that changed to have a venue or an avenue to accept unsolicited proposals. So we had the policy put forward and adopted by our board last July, and their recommendation to us was to then generate some procedures, so not only do they approve of accepting unsolicited proposals, but we've now created sort of a pathway for receiving them, and we have sort of this little simple one-page template followed by about 30 pages of very complex procedures. So there is a sort of an avenue now to accept unsolicited proposals. So again, when I put these sort of 4 projects up as things that we're looking at as the P3 program, that's just sort of the starting point, that if there's a private concessionaire or really anybody that wanted to bring a proposal forward to Metro, they could then do it as an unsolicited proposal. We have sort of the procedures to review that, what it would take to sort of get it approved, and then the sort of competition that it would take from either a sole source or a competitive bid to move forward as a procurement through Metro. Sort of following our traditional procurement guidelines, but with this additional caveat of unsolicited proposals. And of course, as with anything that we change here, when we were talking about this probably a year ago, there was just a lot of interest and everybody telling us that as soon as this opened, they were going to drop an unsolicited proposal on us, and that we had to brace ourselves. So I think this was approved in February, and I haven't heard not to say that we won't, but it hasn't happened yet. So I know there's some interest. Again, some of the smaller projects that might come forward, we have some sustainability, power purchase agreements, feed-in tariff agreements. For solar projects that will likely come through this, just because we're not looking at all of our properties and all of our rooftops for that viability. So we've sort of created this avenue through sort of the different enabling legislation that we have, including the green energy.
How is conservation including this in for saving money?
So we have some sustainability goals,
right,
and depending on if it's a project-based or as a solar P3, we might look at it as that. So if we can start to monetize what that savings would be, like we would do in a solar project, then we can start to evaluate it that way. For the larger projects, the horizontal alignments, or maybe even putting solar canopies on our even our bus shelters or our alignments, we would take that into the life of project cost and then reverse it on the funding if there was either energy savings that we quantify or agreements that we'd get with SCE or DWP on that. And so again, this was adopted in February, and we're anticipating some the next steps for the P3 program is, again, I just wanted to give a quick overview. Sort of, this was changing right as David was speaking last year, but basically the realignment for the program, moving it from its sort of traditional house in our real estate group into the planning group, into the capital development group under David Yale. So to better align sort of the P3 program, which for lack of better terms, with the money at Metro. So that once the projects do have some momentum, we'd have an understanding of the financial resources and commitment it would take to move it forward. So it's, again, just a better alignment with sort of the needs that they get projects done in Metro, and sort of a bigger tent on making sure that everybody, all the different disciplines within Metro, work in coordination. And so right now, the managing executive officer for the P3 program is David Yale, and he's also in charge of the long-range planning, the financial forecast, the grants management, and has 50 to 70 people reporting to him. Underneath him is an executive officer, which is an opening that the board approved last July. We're still waiting to have that filled. And then I think under that we have both the deputy executive officer and myself. And again, the role of that is to coordinate the program between the different subject matter experts at Metro, any program advisors, project advisors we have, and make the project determinations on a project-by-project basis rather than a holistic sort of program-wide basis. And this sort of comports with how we see projects moving forward at Metro. We have sort of the good foundation that we were provided, and now we're able to look at each of these projects individually and determine whether they make sense and can move forward within the constructs of Metro. Any question on that? So the next sort of step is this potential ballot measure, and what I think David Yale really sees is the future of the P3 program, as hopefully I've illustrated on some of these earlier slides, is that we have large capital funding gaps for all of the P3 programs or P3 projects that we've identified. We think that the state and the federal sources are fairly limited. I mean, getting the feds to approve any sort of a highway trust fund enhancements proven to be challenging, or even maintaining what they have. So we think that going forward, our ability to get money out of the state or out of the Fed, out of Caltrans, out of the Highway Trust Fund is pretty limited, which will make us more of a truly self-help county based on a state and federal level. So we need to look at what's in our LRTP and what we can deliver through P3 program as an equity source and a funding source, and the ability to help mitigate some of the funding gaps that we have in this program. But we really think that a new ballot measure is going to be the only way to get additional capital into the program. All of the toll projects that we have, or the rail projects that we have, which don't make enough money necessarily on the rail side to cover operating costs, and the size of our toll programs, although they're always or typically been revenue positive for us, can't close these multi-billion-dollar funding gaps. So we think the potential ballot measure that identifies some of these key projects will really be what's necessary to do it. And right now, what we're looking at is an additional half-cent sales tax starting in 2017 that we think would generate over a 40-year horizon somewhere around $76 billion, which of course would then be split out with all the sub-regions and everything else. But it would really sort of ignite the P3 program, the funding potential for these projects, and get a lot of the projects that were identified as Measure R, but not fully funded, built, as well as some new projects that we think could be built with that $76 billion. And $76 billion sounds like a big number, because it is. But again, sort of the ability of this county to tax itself and to build transportation is really gotten us to where we are. And we think we've delivered a lot of good projects through Measure R, but there's still a lot of needs, as I'm sure you recognize trying to get here tonight. I think that's about it. Oh, this is sort of my disclaimer slide. And again, this came from our executive office about just what they wanted to say here. And just to remind everybody that we're not viewing P3s as a funding tool. It's a financing tool, but it's not bringing money to the project. The equity developer, their cost of capital is greater than public funding, as I think the question was earlier. The public funds for the project, as I've said a million times, are paid back in tolls or taxes. The benefits of a P3 are really seen in some of either the alternative technical concepts, the design, and sort of acceleration that we see in construction, as well as the life cycle costs. So we're not going to see on the financing savings, but certainly there's other components of it as we start to measure the full life cycle costs and the shifting of certain risks that we don't necessarily want to carry. Those are the true benefits that we would see. There are some counter arguments to that with paying the maintenance fees and sort of being locked into that versus sort of the flexibility we have now to move around some of our maintenance and operations as the programs dictate. And the last bullet, the last major bullet, is sort of the split incentive between jurisdictions. And again, that goes back to our public sector partner, Caltrans, and sort of their incentive on a P3 is that if we take the ownership of the roadway, or give it to a concessionaire, and they're responsible for the design, building, operations, and maintenance of it, it relieves Caltrans from that maintenance burden and makes Metro, through its availability payments, take that risk on. And so they've got to sort of move away from the maintenance piece. We don't do the maintenance, but we reimburse the developer for it. And so this was an issue that we had with sort of the I-5 North project, the RD project a year ago, is that we never really resolved with Caltrans who would cover that maintenance cost or how it would be covered through an availability payment and whether we would get sort of our fair share. So when we're looking at sort of a public sector comparison, it makes it somewhat equitable between, you know, public delivery and private delivery, but we felt that we were paying Caltrans' share of that. So until we sort of resolve that issue with our beloved state partner, we have sort of an impasse on what to do with P3s. And the fact that P3 legislation expires in a year and a half. So we don't have the ability right now to do a P3 starting in January 1st, 2017, although we're working diligently to get that authority extended.
That's a state authorization?
That's right, California state enabling legislation. Yes?
Is Metro's legislative affairs working with any of the state legislators to extend that, and then working with the industry like Mike Snyder and others to get the input to see how it would be most helpful to everybody?
I don't know. I know they've talked with Mike. I don't know on how much frequency. I know our legislative affairs group updates me, I think, daily on the status of that legislation, sort of the where we can help them, the language that they're crafting, how it might extend it, what the opposition is to it, and how we might resolve some of that concern. So our government affairs, legislative affairs group is working pretty actively on it. It gives them a sense of purpose every morning, I think. So yeah, they're hard at it.
They support extending it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes.
It's important that we see a win for the business community and Metro and everybody.
Yeah, and we're optimistic, although it's not far from complete, I guess.
Would Metro have to comply with federal securities laws on these P3s, and when would that process start if you have to do some kind of bond disclosures that other people have to do?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, you know, right now, if we would do a project through any, you know, $1 of federal money in a project, literally $1 of federal money makes it a federal project. And so that $1 gives us the need to comply with all federal laws, rules, and regulations on that project. So that anything that's got federal money in it would have that. Security laws, as it relates back to sort of a P3 or private legislation, also come into that. I think whatever sort of sunshine that they would need to do that, we would have to comply with. We would want to comply with.
What's happening with the current extension of the federal transportation act? Isn't that going to expire this year?
The Highway Trust Fund?
And that, everything, the transit, everything.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's set to run out of money. So yeah, I guess, I mean, again, I know Metro's federal legislative group is working hard with our elected representatives in both houses of Congress to enact legislation, support legislation extending that and ensuring that there is a transportation program going forward, and that, again, California, through our current Congress members, has gotten a pretty good deal on a lot of projects. And we're able to have a lot of heft in Congress, both because of our size and the power of our congressional officers. But you know, we're working to do that. There's a good deal of opposition that doesn't want necessarily to move at the same speed. So it's likely that the proverbial can will get kicked down the street a little bit further. But you know, Metro's trying to work with all its electeds to get laws and
That includes
legislation
the
back.
TIFIA authority or expanded TIFIA authority?
The whole bill expires in 3 weeks.
But the new bill will have expanded TIFIA authority or hope for, or something?
Well, I think TIFIA we're okay with. So it's the funding of it. So every year, not every year, but every 2 years, you get a new funding amount through TIFIA. Right now, it's not fully fully tapped out, so we still have a lot of cap under TIFIA. We're looking at changing some of the rail side of that, what's currently called a RIF loan, what could be called a RIFIA loan, to expand the size of that program to look a little bit more like TIFIA on the rail side, but a lot of that's intercity rail. So that might change, and again, that's already funded on the RIFIA side. So the TIFIA, we still have some I guess room to put projects into that pile. We were looking at doing a TIFIA loan this year on the west side Purple Line Extension, section 2. So we'll make another ask of the TIFIA program, making us, I think, the largest subscriber to TIFIA when that closes. If it's not in sequestration. Yes?
I know you're primarily concerned with financial things, but I'm wondering, with all the talk about R2, how much do you think, or is Metro concerned at all that the California Transportation Plan 2040, which stressed on moving away from new roadways and additional lane, will have on the voters for measuring, for passing Metro R2?
Yeah, I think, again, this is sort of my personal perspective as part of the P3 program, is that we're very concerned about that. Again, we don't think, as a planning agency and a transportation agency, that we can build our way out of this on the freeway side of things. We can, again, sort of minimize things and make life a little bit better in the future. Again, going back 30 years and those levels of traffic and congestion are going to be hard to do by building. There might be other technology advances that come to fore that help us there, but we don't think we can build out of that, certainly by putting more lanes of freeway out there. So what we are trying to do is provide more options and more alternatives for everybody, be it on the single occupancy vehicles, HOV lanes, with our transit options, our bus options, and other pieces of our program that we think we can make more efficient without building more roadways.
But 3 out of those 4 projects involve roadways.
I think, again, the High Desert Corridor would be a new roadway. The rest of them would be sort of improvements on current roadways or enhancements to surface alternatives that are currently taking place. We don't think there's going to be a lot of induced demand from any of those projects.
Really? Interesting.
I don't think. Again, people are getting where they're going now. Think like, the example being on 710 South and North. A lot of those are just being forced onto arterials and clogging up surface streets rather than on sort of the primer, larger, faster moving highways. So if we can improve the operational efficiency on those highways, we'd like them to have that alternative. Obviously, we can't force that upon them, but that's alternative. And even those still, like 710 still has sort of a rail option that we'd like to see in place. Sepulveda Pass has a rail option we'd like to see in place. High Desert has a rail option that we'd like to see go forward. So again, it's as much about choice as it is about just trying to build more roads. Yes?
For the Sepulveda Pass, when do you anticipate doing some more study on the project?
On the project definition, I came from a meeting this afternoon where we spent 2 hours sort of circling around it. I'm not sure progress was made, but discussions were had. So we continue to do that, and I think, again, we're trying to come out with what we think will be the next step, which is likely some type of a TNR study, a traffic and revenue study on that. I don't think we have enough project definition to do a full investment grade study at this point, but again, we want to make sure that the numbers we have for traffic and the potential for revenues are accurate, or at least up to date based on current traffic patterns and origin destinations that we see there. So we anticipate, again, sort of the scope of work getting developed in the next month or two. That goes through sort of our labyrinth of procurement and hopefully hit the street in the latter part of summer, early fall. But that'll have sort of a more developed project definition or project description. But we don't have environmental clearance on it. We don't have that started yet. We hope to have some work done on that scope of work by the end of the year to, again, at least start looking at what sort of definitions and what timeline we need to have an environmental document move the project forward. But that'll largely be shaped, I think, on Monday morning when Phil Washington starts. That's my guess. Anything else?
So how detailed do these P3 projects have to be for Measure R2?
For Measure R2,
Because obviously there's going to be a huge funding gap, but you want to sort of get them, at least in the enabling legislation.
Yeah, so, well, the enabling legislation gives us the authority to create P3 projects that we can lease or have a developer build. So we can do it sort of based on our terms. We don't have to do it in advance. I think we'd like to have further definition if we want to go to the ballot with these as projects. So we'd like to just have a description as to what we'd like done. Part of the strength of a P3 is giving the private sector the opportunity to build a project as efficiently and effectively as they can, not as we dictate, but as they think will meet the needs and fit the goals that we have for the project. So if we have goals for congestion relief or air quality improvements, they'll meet those goals as the standards, but it will really let the final sort of determination on the design up to them. But we'd like to have a more robust project description, certainly on Sepulveda Pass. The rest of those are primarily dictated by the EIR and the local preferred.
So it's not a requirement that you have all the details there?
Not currently. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Well, we can do another hour. But, suppose. Anyway, I want